Well, first of all, thank you very much for spending your evening with me. This is going to be somewhat of a different presentation from those I've given in the past, if only because I really haven't had too much recourse to notes or material during my presentations. This is because if you're not familiar with something, usually notes aren't going to help you. But in this case, I have a lot of notes that I have to refer to because it goes far beyond my ability to remember all these things. So if I'm looking off to the side sometimes at notes, I really do have them. The other thing is, well, what does technology, ancient technology, have to do with theosophy? What possible relationship is there? Well, actually, there's a profound relationship, because these examples of sometimes truly astounding technology that were achieved hundreds and thousands of years ago by people that are now extinct in some cases, all came from civilizations that were in their time highly advanced, luxuriant, capable, and now they're gone. And all that remains are these little wisps and suggestions and tiny fragments that are being found now. There's some terrific discoveries being made, I mean, like immediately. This is not a rehash of old stuff for the most part anyway. And so the question arises, how is it conceivable that a high culture that lasted for hundreds of years had every element of luxury and even technology on a level of our own, and in many cases beyond our own level of technology, as hard as that is to imagine, that's now accepted by medical professionals as well as archaeologists and technicians in all fields of technology? How is it possible that those societies vanished utterly, nothing left of them? Well, Edgar Cayce said that they placed too much emphasis on technology. They got to the point where technology in itself is neither good nor bad. It's neither moral or immoral, unless it's used in an immoral way. And there was a fine line that these ancient civilizations crossed, where they felt that they had license to do anything they wanted to do because their technology was so advanced and becoming more advanced all the time that it gave them so much power, almost limitless power, that it excused all forms of ethical and moral behavior. And when that happened, the technology turned on them and destroyed them utterly. And it's hard to avoid the parallel with today. With our technology is speeding ahead, achieving great things, but morally and ethically and as a culture, we're not doing too well. We're going actually in the opposite direction. Well, that's in the way of an introduction, I guess, to an excuse for talking about this ancient technology in terms of theosophy. But there's something more cogent than that even. When Madame Blavatsky was studying and gathering her material early in her life, literally early in her life, she went to India. She sought out some of these holy people, sometimes in very inaccessible parts of the world, of India. And it took her years to gather this information that went into her research that became theosophy. And in one instance, she spoke with a very wise man I'd never heard of before, who was quite advanced in his years. And if I get his name right, some of you may know this name because he's better known than I assumed he was, is Brahmamahi Bawa. And Brahmamahi Bawa had access to these records that he would share with her orally, but could not show her. They were in a very deplorable condition. And one of them was known as the Loka Panati, the Loka Panati. If you want to look this up, there are references to it, especially on theosophical websites, spelled Loka-Pannatti. And in the old Hindu dialect, it meant a description of the world. What it meant was a description of the world before modern times. And in the Loka Parnati, there was something described as the speaking beast. And the speaking beast was, quote unquote, an elemental vehicle machine that had been created by a deeply ancient culture, probably referring to the Indus Valley cultures of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, these great Indus Valley cities that go back easily 5,000 years ago. We know very little about them, except that these civilizations were so advanced they had a plumbing system that would be on a par with what we have today. Their irrigation and their levels of social hygiene were very high. Everybody had their own private baths and bathed often. And this elemental vehicle machine that's mentioned in the Loka Panati was supposed to be a protector of the relics of Buddha. Buddha, apparently there were some slivers of bone and apparently some like a prayer shawl or something that he had. And these were considered, of course, very important sacred relics. And this ancient society had built this speaking beast, which was a mechanical or a technological guardian. And its description sounds very similar in some respects to modern day automated weaponizing of artificial intelligence, where now there are these, for lack of a better understanding of these automated soldiers, automated tanks that require no crews, but are able to engage in battle without much instruction. This apparently was foreshadowed very long time ago. So here, even Madame Blavatsky, the founder of Theosophy, talks about this high technology that was available so long ago. And that society, of course, we don't even know its name. It vanished because perhaps to some extent it depended too entirely on its technological greatness. So I'm going to talk on here for about 20, 25 minutes. We'll take a break and then I'll finish the rest. I don't intend to describe any of these examples of high technology in too much detail because there's so many of them. But I can mention them to give you a flavor of the incredible greatness of our ancestors and the surprising things that they achieved, both of a small scale and a large scale. And the one we can begin with is early in the book. If you want to put this one up there, Paul, of the bicycle rider, can you put that one up there? You able to get that one up there, Paul? There we go. This doesn't seem like much in itself. It shows a man in apparently Hindu garb riding a bicycle. The difficulty is this carving, this engraving in bas relief. And I have to again rely on my notes. Is at a place you can visit today. It's called Pancha Varnas Wami, and this is in southeast India. And Pancha Varnas Wami is at least 1,800 years old. So if you see something like this, you think, oh, well, somebody must have come in and for some reason in a temple carved this of a man on a bicycle. That's not the case because records have been assiduously kept on this temple in southeast India and show that the repairs to the temple were nowhere near where this took place. Not only that, but it has been determined, as I explain in greater detail in the book, that it is impossible to have carved this image on the temple the way it is now vertically. It had to be done horizontally. The very placement of it makes it impossible for it to have been carved. The first bicycle was built in 1817 in Germany. That's the earliest known. And here this temple goes back at least 1,800 years, and it shows a conventional bicycle. Well, how is it that none of the bicycles from 1,800 years ago are around today? Because they're made of perishable materials. We're only going to have images at most of these things. It's just one example, which is not too well known outside of India, by the way. But the legitimacy of this carving is unquestioned. Critics don't even address this. If you go to this temple today, the tourist guides, for the most part, will avoid this particular image because it is such an inconvenient illustration of something that existed long ago. Okay, we can go to the next one. These are whistles, and they are in great abundance. They were carved by the Aztecs, who, as a high civilization in middle Mexico, were overthrown by the Spanish in the early 16th century. These whistles, some of them go back much further than the Aztecs. For those of you who are not familiar with the basic pre-Columbian history of Mexico, the Aztecs were preceded by earlier peoples, the Zapotecs and so forth. Before them came the Maya. Before the Maya came the Olmec and so forth. So there are many different layers of cultures, different cultures that spoke different languages, were different ethnically, but were fundamentally related in that they shared Mexico together. But these whistles are a level of technology which is truly astounding. There are at least dozens of them, possibly hundreds that have been found. Most are from the Aztec period. That's from about 1400 AD to, or excuse me, about 1300 AD to about early 1500s. And these whistles, when they are blown and they still function, they are able to reproduce sounds of human beings and animals that are so lifelike that they are virtually indistinguishable from the real thing. This object and objects like them were created hundreds, and it would appear many thousands of years ago, long before the advent of any recording device. They're called death whistles for obvious reasons, like this one is in the shape of a stylized skull. Many of the whistles have been cut in half so we can get a good idea of the cross section. Archaeologists today still cannot understand why these whistles, and acoustic experts are still baffled on why these small whistles held in the hand are able to make these sounds. This particular whistle, when blown, is a terrifying sound. It sounds like a man screaming. Other whistles sound like women screaming or children screaming. Other whistles sound like jaguars or different jungle animals. Because these whistles have been found in such great abundance, it's assumed that they were used by armies, so that when the Aztecs were coming up against their enemies, just before they would charge or attack or whatever their maneuver was, they would have all of the soldiers blow these whistles. So you would have many hundreds of men sounding these terrifying whistles. And it would have, of course, a great psychological impact on an enemy to suddenly be confronted. You're expecting a battle anyway, and then you're confronted by this sound of all these people crying out in agony. None of these sounds are pleasant. There are some that have reproduced bird sounds quite well, but even those bird sounds are related to predatory birds like hawks and so forth. So it would appear that these were involved not in any happy celebrations, but as military weapons, psychological warfare. But nonetheless, the technology that has gone into these little masterpieces is still not known, which means that we cannot reproduce this today. We don't know why these things work so well. So it's amazing. Well, we go on to the next one. These are, this is an example of the earliest snow goggle. And all it is just a walrus bone, sometimes whale bone, with these slits for the eyes. And it doesn't seem like much to us now. But the design for these go back to literally the very first, the earliest known, historically known people migrating out of Siberia into North Africa across the Bering Land Bridge. Of course, we do know that people came much earlier than 12,000 years ago to our continent, but nonetheless, at least the forebears of today's modern Indians, most of them Native Americans, the DNA studies have shown that they are primarily rooted in Siberia, and their ancestors crossing the Bering Straits into this early Arctic region, actually Arctic region, were confronted with a harsh environment that was even worse than things in Siberia. And so they invented these snow goggles because confronted by a vastness of snow and ice glinting off the sun, you could go snowblind very easily. But these goggles, they work extremely well. And they have been dated back to about 12,000 years ago. So some inventive genius was able to make this, and they're still made by native people up there, and they still work. They shut out the sunlight, but leave enough space open so you can make your way across the environment. It's an incredibly advanced and innovative concept. There's even a greater one, though, that's coming up now, this next one. This is a truly astounding mystery. It is a beautiful bracelet. It's made out of a kind of quartz-like material. The object you see that we have today to the right, upper right, that's the way it's preserved. And then on the left, we see recreation of how this bracelet was originally. It's a beautiful, simple work, and it also is from Siberia. And the trouble is, the hole, the perforation, was found to be incredibly precise. Incredible because this object has been clearly dated back to 40,000 years ago. 40,000 years is inconceivable. We're talking about a time steeped in the last ice age. And the organic material retrieved from the discovery of this beautiful jade-like bracelet confidently dates it back to about 40,000 years ago. And that hole is remarkable. If we can show the next slide. This hole was astounding to archaeologists because of the precision involved. We believed that 40,000 years ago, human culture was of a very low level, just involved in survival, and not too much in terms of really creative material accomplishment. This, though, the grooves that are shown here in these white arrows, the grooves show that this hole, this perforation, was made and could have only been made by a high-speed drill. What we're looking at are the marks that could have only been made by a machine tool. A machine tool 40,000 years ago? How is that possible? I don't have any answers to that at all, but this is the evidence. Those grooves clearly show that it was not done with a hand drill or scooped out. These are the ridges that can only be made by a power drill. And that conclusion was established by construction engineers who didn't even know what this object was. It was shown to them by the archaeologists and said, well, how was this made? They said, well, we know exactly how this was made. We can do the same thing here. We've got a power drill, and I can make the same identical way. So next one. This is a coin. I'm not going to dwell on this too long. This is a coin from about 200 BC, about 200 years before Christ. And it's of a ruler, a king of Sparta. His name was Nabis. And Nabis had at his command one of these speaking beasts that are described by Madame Blavatsky in her travels through India. He had a robot that was so lifelike that it reproduced the mannerisms and physical resemblance of his recently deceased wife, whose name was Apega. And Apega, which means in English, the beloved one, Apega was a true queen of Sparta. she exercised terrific political power. She died apparently of natural causes of some kind, fairly young in life. She wasn't yet 40 years old. And he was, King Nabis was able to reproduce her image so authentically that he used it in court long after she had died. Her death was mandated as a state secret because of all of the political ramifications her sudden death would have had. And so he preserved her literally alive in this reproduction that was so authentic. Now, you would think, well, this is just a myth, just a story. Not archaeologists so much, but anthropologists and now people involved in artificial intelligence are tracing back elements of this myth, which again, I don't have time to get into the details for if we want to go on to the rest of these, that say that it is rooted in fact. The story of Nabis does not originate in myth. As a matter of fact, there was a very brilliant scientist, a Greek scientist by the name of Polybulus. And Polybulus, at the same time that King Nabis was alive, he wrote about this Alpaga artificial intelligence, saying that it could move and even to a limited degree speak. And Polybulus is remarkable because he is a science writer. He never wrote myth. He never wrote about things that he couldn't prove or that were not established. Most of his work is lost with the ancient world, but at least a couple of his volumes still survive. And all of these volumes, they never deal with stories or myths or fairy tales, nothing like that. He's talking about the outstanding achievements of his day, including mostly irrigation and things like that. And then he mentions this right along with that. So that has given rise to the conclusion that Nabis did have something that was so close to an artificial intelligence that it could have existed. We have to understand that this artificial intelligence that King Nabis had was really in the context of what Sparta was at that time. The Spartans are remembered for being great warriors, but they were greater than that. They invented steel, for example. Steel did not exist until it was invented by the Spartans. That was one of the reasons why they became so victorious in most of their encounters. They were almost always outnumbered, but because they had superior metallurgy. If you're fighting an enemy who has a bronze or a copper sword, it doesn't amount to much if you've got a steel sword. They also had steel armor, steel helmets. We do know for a fact that the Spartans were highly innovative people. How far did that innovation go? And at least as far as King Nabis and the reproduction of his wife, Alpaga. He even used this, I won't go on too long, but it's a fascinating story. He even used this artificial intelligence version of Alpaga, his wife, to collect debts that were owed to the state. Because if someone came to the court and wanted some more excuse for more time or wanted to talk his way out of debts or so forth, he would have Alpaga stand up and point a condemning finger at the accused, as it were, and who was so horrified by this that he'd pay up or make arrangements to pay right away. So it's a very interesting story. And the next one, this is a relatively modern, this goes back maybe 100, 150 years ago. It's a romantic reproduction of another example of artificial intelligence. And this was known as Telos. Telos, the name might be familiar to some of you, appeared in a 1960s film by Roy Harryhausen. It was a very successful film, still seen today. It's called Jason and the Argonauts. And it's about Greek myth in which Jason and the Argonauts go to the island of Crete. And the island of Crete is defended by this mechanical man who makes it very difficult for them to rob the treasure there. So I won't go into the long story there. It's very effectively done. Special effects were terrific for that time. And Telos, the real myth of Telos, does not describe him as a man or even as a him. Here we see it romanticized. The original myth of Talos, and it is a myth nonetheless, the Talos of myths describes a mechanical device that on its own would patrol 3 times a day the coastline of Crete and could somehow determine if people visiting Crete were either friend or foe. So if an ally or someone who lived at Crete was coming back, Talos would not bother them. But if a stranger tried to land, Talos would be able to hurl large stone balls or boulders at the enemy ship. And if the enemy landed after all or survived this artillery barrage, it was equipped with weapons of some kind that would fight off the invaders. Admittedly, it's a myth, but the thing about myth is that a myth would not be told for thousands and thousands of years over and over again if it was just a good story. What we've found is that any myth that persists for that length of time must have a kernel of truth in it. And myth is nothing more than the elaboration of a story that's told over and over again, like different layers, thin layers of an onion. And you peel them back and you do come to a kernel of historic fact. Talos is, especially with the advent of artificial intelligence these days, is taken very seriously by people like Elon Musk as examples of some kind of highly advanced artificial weaponization of artificial intelligence that took place many thousands of years ago. And while nothing of Talos physically still exists, his description is eerily similar to some of the tasks that are being assigned to the military use of artificial intelligence today. Okay, we can go to the next one. This is an early example of a manned kite. This goes back to the early 20th century. And it was used as a military reconnaissance by some armies, even in the early days of World War I. The first kite of its kind, a manned kite, goes back to 400 BC. There was an inventor by the name of Archytas of Tarentum. This was in Greece. And his military kites had young men, usually about 13 or 14 years of age, who were put into these kites, rather hazardous adventure, and they were flown as military intelligence for military observation to see the enemy. That's quite an achievement for 400 BC. We know that Archytas's kites were made out of leather. The reason I bring this up, even though this type of manned kite is no longer in use and hasn't been for some time, it shows that the ancients were interested in the application of aviation, flight, in this case for military reasons. And it's just the beginning. We can go to the next one. This is a remarkable reproduction made by a professional balloonist by the name of Jim Woodman. And Jim Woodman, like many people around the world, became fascinated by something called the Nazca lines. And these Nazca lines are the largest art gallery in the world. They're on the Pacific coast of Peru, for those of you who are not familiar with them. And they are the representations of various animals and sometimes geometric designs, abstract designs, and lines themselves that run perfectly straight for hundreds of miles. No one knows who built them. They were called the Nazca lines just out of convenience. They're assigned to a culture known as the Nazca culture, but these are just archaeologists' ways of trying to put some kind of a handle on these things. And Jim Woodman always thought, well, it seems so strange that the ancients would have built this or have made this tremendous art gallery and not being able to see it, because from the ground, these images are impossible to make out. I've been to Nazca. I've stood at the base of even some of the smaller of these various designs, and they mean absolutely nothing from ground level. And they have a tower there that the Tourist Bureau has put in, and you can climb this tower goes up to about 45 feet. And you look out over the Nazca Plain and you just barely make these images out. And only the smaller ones, the larger ones you cannot make out from 45 feet, impossible. The only way that these things come into perspective is from the air, high in the air. You have to rent an airplane and you fly over at several hundred feet, and then you see this incredible, astounding gallery of birds and pelicans and frigate birds and spiders and sometimes human beings with doing strange gestures, and triangles and spirals, just amazing. So Jim Woodman thought, like, these people must have had some way to view these things from altitude. There are no mountains in the desert, the Peruvian desert, absolutely flat. How did they fly? How could they have possibly learned flight? But they must have. Well, make a long story short, he learned that various Indian tribes, remote tribes in the Amazon, still today make aerostats. Aerostats are these small envelopes made out of a kind of a heavy leaf. And they sew these leaves together and they leave the bottom open. And they configure them in such a way that they put little fire pots underneath them and they fly through the air. They're miniature hot air balloons. And the Amazonian Indians, the various tribes of the Amazonian Indians that still make these things to this day, say that they had received that from their ancestors a very long time ago. So extrapolating on that, he found some other indications, not only on the Amazonian Indians, but there are some very peculiar Nazca pottery, which show people flying through the air. And so he recreated this hot air balloon based on made exclusively with the materials that were available to the ancients 2,000 and more years ago. It's a hot air balloon, and it worked incredibly well. And from that altitude, he was able to see some of these creatures. Just one more thing about Nazca, and this has really maybe nothing to do with what we're talking about, but it's so amazing that I need to talk about a little bit. And that is, again, I'll make this as quickly as I can. There was a mathematician last year. I have all the facts, but I'm not going to drag it all out here. There was a mathematician, an American mathematician last year, who also was fascinated with the Nazca lines. And what he did, something nobody else has done before or thought about doing, he said, well, these Nazca lines, the straight lines, they seem to just go off straight through the desert and then they stop. For no particular reason, there's nothing there and they're dead straight on. They've been surveyed long ago. And so he extrapolated them and drew them around the world, extended them on a computer image. And you can see this, by the way, on YouTube. And he extended these lines around the globe and just see what would happen from Nazca. And interestingly, when you see his recreation, the Nazca lines, they have even when they're extended around the entire globe, the entire planet, there's a regularity about them and a spacing. That's kind of interesting in itself, but that's not the big thing. So they extend entirely around the world, and then at a certain place on the globe, they all come together again. They all dissect. They travel apart all around the whole globe, and then at one spot, they all converge. Now, where do they converge? They converge at a place in Cambodia, which maybe some of you have heard of. It's called Angkor Wat. Angkor Wat is the greatest temple that has ever been made before or since. It's huge. It's beyond description. And yet that's where all of these lines converge. Not only that, the distance, the distance between Nazca, where these lines are, and Angkor Wat is precisely, and I mean precisely, halfway around the globe. It's exactly. Now, the globe, of course, is not a perfect sphere. It's oblate. It's more egg-shaped than basketball-shaped. So if you extended those lines from a different spot from Nazca, they wouldn't match up. halfway around the world, but they're exactly at the halfway. So the question is, who did that? And so long ago, maybe the people that built things like this and others. Now, it's getting a little late, so I'm going to take a little break if that's okay. Does that work in with this sort of a setup here, or should I go on? I don't know what's the proper format here. Should I continue, Paul?
Let's see. It's 10 minutes to 8. Would you be well, a little early, maybe? I mean, we could take.
Okay, well, I can keep going.
You could go like 20 more minutes. It'd be like
okay.
8:10. That might be.
I get so carried away with this, I lose all track of time. I don't
no, that's fine.
I don't want to put anybody to sleep on this stuff.
Yeah, no. I think probably 20 more minutes would be.
All right. Well,
be good.
You just let me know.
All right.
I'll continue on it.
I'll get the video back up.
Okay, that's good.
All right. You're getting fan mail in the chat area, by the way. So
hate mail.
You're doing well. Okay, hold on.
And we can go to the next slide after the balloon. The next one, yeah. This is a remarkable artifact that was found about 80 years ago, oh, more than 80 years ago, almost 100 years ago now. It's called the Saqqara bird. And it's just as a little object that was found inside a tomb dated to about 200 BC. It is now understood that this object is far older than 200 BC because it was found in a debris pile. How old that debris pile is, we don't know, but it could go back over 4,000 years ago. It's very small. It has a 7-inch wingspan. It is a little over 5 inches long. It's made of very light wood, sycamore, and it only weighs about 0.5 of an ounce. And when it was first found, nothing like this had been discovered in Egypt before. And some people thought, well, maybe it's a weather vane of some kind. Why anybody would be buried with a weather vane, I can't understand unless he was a weatherman. I don't know that they had any back in those days. But in any case, some people thought it represented a glider or a little plane, an airplane. Well, that's impossible. How could anybody have a glider in ancient Egypt, for gosh sakes? But that was nonetheless a point of controversy for a long time. The archaeologists laughed at the idea that this thing was actually an aircraft of some kind, until as recently as 2007. One of those persons who was interested in the possible aeronautical qualities of this artifact was Simon Sanderson. Simon Sanderson was and is one of the leading glider pilots in the world. He's a sport glider champion, has set many records. And what he did, to him, it looked like it was aeronautically possible. So what he did is he took this to the University of Liverpool in England. And the reason why he did that was because the university there has one of the most outstanding computer recreation complexes anywhere in the world. So they can take an object and they can analyze it at such an incredibly detailed level that it can reveal all of its contours, all of its capabilities, and so forth. So he made a 3D structural profile of this object. And with this 3D profile, he was then able to enlarge it to regular size. And he found that it's regular size being the size of a glider with a wingspan of about 18 feet. And through computer animation, you could actually ride this thing or fly this thing. And that's what he did. He flew it. And the aeronautical capabilities of this object, as through the computer regeneration, show unquestionably that this is a glider. It has, for example, dihedral. Dihedral is, which means that the wings are shaped in such a way that they create the Bernoulli effect. That means that the aircraft don't fly because the they're flying on top of the air, but because they create a small vacuum behind the trailing edge or by the trailing edge of a wing. That's what this has. This is a reproduction of a device that actually flew. And originally, this thing could have probably been flown and could fly it today. You could launch it through the air, but nobody's going to do that, of course, with a valuable artifact like this. So this artifact proves conclusively that the ancient Egyptians, at least 200 BC, understood, at the very least, they understood the aeronautical properties necessary to fly a heavier than air craft. Now that's an outstanding thing to say. It seems utterly ridiculous, but nonetheless, the facts as they're revealed by this 3D structural profile confirm that this is it. Why is it that we haven't found any more like this? Where are the originals? What happened to them? Again, they were made of perishable materials. The real mystery is how come there's no reference to them in the Egyptian record that we have? And there's a lot of Egyptian records left. So there's a lot of mysteries to this. But nonetheless, somebody in ancient Egypt understood heavier than aircraft. Egypt actually is a great place, has always been, for a glider because you have heat thermals. They have gliding events in Egypt constantly because of the rising thermals, the heat thermals. You can, if you're a skilled pilot like Simon Sanderson, you can fly your glider plane over Egypt all day from sunrise to sunset. It's only after the sun goes down, the temperatures begin to decline, that you lose lift capability. So you could theoretically, more than theoretically, fly an object like this all day over Egypt, because they're doing it now. Next one. Here is Simon Sanderson at the University of Liverpool, and this is the 3D recreation profile that was made that revealed all of these aeronautical aspects to this little glider. Next. This is something known as the pigeon. This was also invented by the same Greek inventor I mentioned earlier, Achitas of Tarentum. This was a steam-powered flying device of compressed air. And according to my notes here, that it had a flight range of over 650 feet. This appears to have been an experimental device. It didn't have any adornment or any religious associations whatsoever. It was a pure scientific experimental prototype of some kind. But this is, you can just see by this basic design, highly, highly advanced for something that was taking place 2,400 years ago. We can go to the next one. Now, beyond the achievements in aeronautics that the ancients had, especially in Egypt, their skill in medicine was highly advanced and is becoming better understood than ever before. When ancient Egyptian language was first transcribed about 150 or 200 years ago, archaeologists were perplexed because most of the medical remedies used in ancient Egypt seemed to be utterly ridiculous and ineffectual. Now that we understand the language better and we are able to see just what the Egyptian doctors were using for their patients, it reveals a level of medical technology that is just beyond anything understood. Go to the next one. This is an example of what the ancient Egyptians did for brain surgery. This is known as trepanning. Trepanning is where you literally cut a hole into the skull to administer to the affected area of the brain. This skull was of a man who was 36 years old. After he had this operation, he lived a normal life. He lived to be in his early or mid 60s. That's how it was called. The healing done around the hole was complete. This object of this man's skull is not all that rare. And actually, hundreds of skulls like this have been found in Egypt and elsewhere. and they show a survival rate of close to 90%, about 87 to 88% survival rate. That level of brain surgery survival rate was not paralleled until the early to mid 20th century. All this was lost with the fall of the Egyptian civilization. The other interesting thing about this particular hole that was cut into this man's skull was the finesse, the elegance of the instruments that were used to cut so perfectly. The other thing is, how was it possible that the Egyptian doctors, physicians, were able to understand what part of the brain needed to be worked on? There's no evidence that this man had any kind of external tumors or anything of that kind. It was purely an internal situation. How did they possibly know where in the brain this ailment was and how to remove it so successfully? And this is a typical example. Next. This is a coin back to the late Greek period. This would be like about 300 BC, something like that, 300, 200 BC. The figure on the left is apparently a healing god. We don't really know exactly who this is, but the image on the right is far more interesting. This is a plant, and it's known as siliphium. And siliphium was the most sought after plant of the ancient world from the time of Greece, about the time of Alexander the Great, perhaps a little earlier, from the time of Aristotle, about that time, about 300 BC, all the way through the Roman Empire until the very end of the Roman Empire. So for hundreds of years, this was highly sought after. Siliphium grew only in North Africa. It would not transplant anyplace else. It only grew along the Mediterranean coast of Libya. And there were whole farming estates. By that time, the Romans were able to grow this on a huge scale. We don't know exactly what siliphium was because none of it exists. It's completely gone. We do know that siliphium was used for healing in general. It was used to assist the healing process. But the reason why it was so much in vogue is because it supposedly had the quality to preserve one's youth. It was considered to be the plant of immortality. It didn't really grant immortality, of course, but it did have some kind of an age retarding quality. And eventually it became so sought after and prescribed by all of the Greco-Roman doctors for all kinds of ailments that it became extinct. It got overused and vanished. More astounding than that, probably, about siliphium is that it was not at all natural. It was bioengineered. Who could have bioengineered something like this at a time before the modern world? It defies explanation. But siliphium's bioengineering properties, and they know this because at least part of the process still survives, but although not enough to rebuild it, to re-engineer it. Next, this is an example. This is a prosthetic toe. This is from a mummy, ancient Egyptian mummy, about 3,500 years ago. And the realism achieved in this great toe and the leather covering and so forth is of such a high quality that anything close to this wasn't equaled for thousands of years thereafter. The Egyptians excelled in prostheses of all kinds. We can go to the next one. Maybe that will show. Well, this isn't in line, but this is a particular type of crystal that the Vikings had. The Vikings, of course, they flourished from about 750, 780 AD until about 1220 AD, relatively short space of time. During that time, of course, the Vikings were the greatest navigators in the world. And this is known as a sunstone. And one of the reasons why they were such great navigators was because of this humble looking little crystal. If you're far out at sea, you depend particularly for celestial navigation to find out where you are and where you're going so you don't get lost. And getting lost in the North Atlantic is tantamount to destruction. How is it that the Vikings were able to travel such long distances across the North Atlantic? They traveled from Norway to Iceland and Greenland and islands in between, and indications are they went much further than that. They came here. But beyond that, how were they able to stay at sea and navigate so perfectly? It's because of this. If you're traveling at sea, especially in the North Atlantic, say in the bad part of the sailing season, like fall or early winter, that's when the seas get really rough and the skies are very cloudy. You don't have much for sun there. This is able to polarize the sunlight in such a way that you hold it up to the sky and it will show you exactly where those rays are coming from and you know exactly where the sun is. Not only that, this crystal is so receptive, so sensitive that even on cloudy nights in which the clouds are not too thick, but still thick enough to obscure seeing your celestial observation properly, your stellar observation, it will pick up the North Star, the polar star. So this little polarized crystal made it possible for the Viking age to exist and for the Vikings to travel when other people could not. By the time the Middle Ages came around, the Dark Ages, when the Vikings were sailing so successfully, when the sun went down, you had to pretty much land, because nighttime navigation, especially if it was cloudy, was hazardous, extremely hazardous, but not for the Vikings. This is, of course, enabled them to take their enemies by surprise too, with night raids and so forth. Now, this crystal, of course, wasn't anything that was invented, but it was found and understood. It isn't. It is a form of crystal that is not unique to Scandinavia, but the Vikings, because of their maritime genius, were able to see the possibilities of this. Okay, the next one. This is what I wanted to get to earlier. This is the statue of a scribe, as you can see, obviously enough. It's in the British Museum, and it dates to easily 4,000 years ago. What's outstanding about it are its eyes. Now, this is not the only statue like this. Not too many more survive. This is one of the best. And this is of this particular scribe. The eyes are cut out of various types of crystal and adhered in a way that is not understood. There's no sign of any glue or adhesive, but the crystals are separate. How they were put together and stay together, curators at the British Museum have never understood. But beyond that, the realism of these eyes shows a knowledge of the optical system that was literally thousands of years ahead of Western medicine. The details that are found in the reproduction of these eyes could really only be done if the artist had some knowledge that could only be provided by a microscope. And I think we can get into that later on, that they did have things like that. But the realism of this statue depends upon the realism of these eyes. I've seen this statue myself, and with proper lighting, it's virtually indistinguishable from a live man. Okay, we can go to the next one. This is something called the Layard lens. It was found in a dig in Iraq. It's from ancient Assyria. It goes back to 650 BC, long time ago. This is the time when Assyria was at its height. This lens, also at the British Museum, is a magnifying glass. It can magnify things twice their size. It represents a kind of optical achievement that was not known again for many centuries after this took place. It turns out that this lens is not as unique as was once thought. It was understood. It was found in the late 1800s. Since that time, there have been other lenses similar to this have been found in other parts of the Near East, even as far north as Troy, the story of the city of Homer's story. Next one. This is something called a yakshal. It looks new. A yakshal is a form of refrigerator, a complex public refrigerator. This is in Iraq. The earliest one goes back about 500 BC, but they were definitely earlier than that. Why is it shaped like this? And what actually did it do? What does it do? You see an entry there, entry point, arched entry point at the bottom. If you wanted to be able to store your perishable foods, you would bring it to this common refrigerator. And that's exactly what it is. It is powered by the sun, by wind power, and is powered by a river. They're all built over, and there are many of these. There were many more in the past. Some still survive. They are built over subterranean streams, sometimes actual rivers. And they're used as cooling element. The object is shaped like a rifle on the inside. And you can kind of gather that from these ridges, so that when the wind strikes these ridges, they spiral downward and join with the water to lower the temperature substantially. So you could have perishable materials that throughout the summer would be preserved properly. Some of these yakshals, of course, they belong to ancient Persia, another civilization long gone. Some of these yakshals still exist, and they are still used in remote areas of Iraq and Iran. This one is outside of Baghdad, about 50 miles outside of Baghdad. They represent the oldest man-made devices that are still operating today. This one, of course, is not a new one. It's just has been renovated. It's just been repaired over time. But the internal devices used, the channels and so forth, the air current channels are still the same after more than 2,000 years. These are oldest objects still in advance. What objects are we making today that'll be around more than 2,000 years from now? Okay, we'll go to the next one.
This would be a good time for a break.
Oh, okay.
Let's
Fine
do it.
enough.
Yeah, let's take what do you think? 5 minutes?
Yeah, as long as is necessary.
Okay. Yeah, we'll take a break until, let's go to 8:20. We'll
Sounds good.
Okay. There we go. There we go. All right.
Okay, you want to go to the next slide then, Paul?
Yeah, let me fire this up again.
You can go the one after this. Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah. Now, this is a place called Chanchan. This is in Peru. This is a pre-Inca site. It's a gigantic city, huge. And here was found a kind of telephone. And it's not like Alexander Graham Bell's exactly. Remember when you were a kid, you would have two paper cups. You put a string between them. And before that.
Right.
There. And you put a string between the vibration, of course, it'd travel along the string, and you could hear somebody talking on the thing. This was found at Chanchan. Chanchan goes back before the Incas, not that long ago. This would be about 1100 AD, but it's a form of telephone communication, and they were thinking in that line. It's not really an example of advanced technology, but it shows you that at least they were thinking in that same direction. Okay, you can go to the next one. This one is known as the water thief, and it's a water clock. This device was invented in Greece a little after the time of Alexander the Great, about 250 BC. And as water enters one part of this device, it raises the plunger, the little man holding a spear. He points to the correct time. So this was a device that was expensive. And the water thief was, if you had a water thief in your house, it meant that you were rather well-to-do, but you had the exact comprehension of time. The reason why I include this is because the gears involved and the mechanism is really elegant. We're all lost with the downfall of the Greco-Roman world around 450 AD. And this type of gear ratio was not really discovered until the late Renaissance. So it gives you some idea of how, when this technology is lost, it's gone almost for good. And it takes hundreds and sometimes thousands of years for human beings to pick up the pieces again and start all over again. The interim period of centuries after the fall of the Roman Empire and the beginning of the Renaissance represented literally hundreds of years of backwardness and a complete dark ages. Really lived up to its name. Okay, the next one.
One moment.
This is an example of how technology can become quite terrible. The Greeks were the first to weaponize animals, bioengineer animals. And in this case, this is a socket that went over the tusk of a war elephant. We can go to the next picture, might show us something of that. And of course, people are familiar with the story of Hannibal crossing the Alps with his elephants. Almost none of them made it, but those that did cross it were ferocious and extremely dangerous weapons that were used. Sometimes the largest number of weaponized elephants ever used at one time was between 500 and 800 of them at a single time. These are like the gigantic tanks of their time. They were specifically trained as war elephants. This illustration doesn't show it too properly, a little bit, but they had head and trunk armor. They had armor over their chest area, and they had spikes on their ankles, so that if they came up to the infantry of their opponents, they would kick them with these great spikes. They were also trained to pick up the enemy in their trunks and dash them to the ground, and they used those great iron sockets on their tusks to spear the enemy. It's really a monstrous, horrible abuse of the animal and of the technology that went into it. The men on top, you see here, they're known as leaders of the occupiers of a mahut. It's an Indian word. It refers to a square shielded platform. And of course, they were archers shooting down on them. That's why a relatively small group like the Carthaginians, under the command of Hannibal, were able to beat the Roman armies continuously for quite a few years. Okay, next. This is an example of the first known machine gun. This is called the Polybius, the Polyborus, excuse me. Polybius is the name of the Greek philosopher. I'm getting my names mixed up here, but the Polybolus, that's what this is. The Polybolus. This was a hand-cranked device that was able to fire iron bolts with the rapidity almost of a machine gun. And it's an example of how you could break the charge of the enemy with just this one single weapon. And the Romans perfected this to a level of efficiency that enabled the empire to become what it was. The next time that a machine gun like that was built was by the British inventor Maxim around 1880. That's the next true machine gun. So that was all lost. Next, this is the world's first flamethrower. It was pushed along on this cart by soldiers who were defended by this arched roof. And this tube you see protruding out of the front was filled with a mixture of some kind unknown and was used as a great syringe. So the soldiers from the rear would then push this plug into the tube like a great syringe, and an enormous bellow of flame would shoot out the front. It was highly effective. It was used to incinerate the great wooden doors of whole cities, and was first used by people called the Boeotians. They were a Greek people, very much outnumbered by their opponents, but were able to overcome their difficulties with this ferocious device. Next. This is the earliest trench mortar. I'm not going to go into these too long because they're gruesome things. This used to was a spring-operated, tension-operated mortar used by the Romans, invented by the Greeks, and was able to hurl hot stone balls at the enemy with an accuracy that was not reproduced until World War I, 2,000 years later. Okay, next. This is a really outstanding example of metallurgical technical greatness that has never been equal. It's beyond anything we are capable of understanding today. This object is called the Svela sword. It's in mint condition. Was found only 2.5 years ago by a couple doing a hunt for old coins in Denmark with a magnetometer. And this was buried just 1 foot beneath the surface in Denmark. And this sword goes back to the Bronze Age, which means it can't be any younger than 3,000 years old. It's probably older than that, but conservatively, it's 3,000 years old. What's remarkable about this sword, besides its preservation, how an unguarded metal object could have been buried in the ground only 1 foot down and be unchanged by time, is amazing. More amazing than that, though, is that it is still sharp. It has lost none of its keen edge. Metallurgists are at an absolute quandary of understanding how this thing could still keep its keen edge after 3,000 years. There are other examples that I talk about in the book that show that the ancient metallurgists were far in advance. They had secrets that are still totally unknown to us, that when lost have never been found. This is just one example of ancient technology that is ahead of anything we know today. There are others. Most of the examples I've shown you are technology that we have since duplicated, that are part of our culture. But things like this still are beyond anything we can know. Next. This is a device that is called the claw for obvious reasons. It really existed. It was accounted for by various peoples who saw it in operation, and it is the brainchild of one of the greatest geniuses of all times, Archimedes. Archimedes is unquestionably the greatest mathematician that ever existed. He lived at a time long before computers. Everything he did was in his head. And he was the scientist in charge of the defense of Syracuse around 220 BC, when it was attacked by the Roman fleet. And the Syracusans were totally outclassed and outnumbered by the Romans. And so they depended upon Archimedes, one of their own, to have these wonder weapons to defend Syracuse with. And he succeeded to a terrific degree. As a matter of fact, it was the superior weapons that he provided that enabled the Syracusans to almost win that war. The war was lost only because of treason. Somebody, for the sake of personal gain, went over from Syracuse to the Romans, told the Romans all of the weak spots of the Syracuse defense, and the Romans prevailed. But if it hadn't been for that, the military weapons provided by the genius of Archimedes were carrying the day. What this device was, it operated entirely with weights and measures. There was no power source. There was no power source in the sense that we understand it today, electricity, of course, or anything like that. But this was an example of Archimedes being able to understand the counterbalancing in weights. What this was a kind of a claw, on the way to explain it, that would grab the prow of a ship, lift it in the air, and then dash it into the sea. And this was in use during the third major attack against Syracuse and foiled the Romans. The Romans were led by a very brilliant military commander himself, who was foiled by these innovative ideas. Next. Archimedes also invented something that was very controversial, that was not believed for a long time. You've probably heard of this before, in which he invented a sun cannon or a sun ray, a ray gun, in which he allegedly incinerated Roman ships that were attacking Syracuse. This is again Syracuse. This is a very old painting to show you how controversial this has been. This painting goes back to the 1400s, and it is done by an Italian architect who tried to show that Archimedes did invent this ray cannon. And what it was is he was able to calculate the precise angle of the sun at a certain time of the day, just when the Romans would appear at a certain spot. All this had to be done through mathematical calculations. He then invented or reinvented, we're not sure, the parabolic mirror, which was able to focus the sun's rays at to their maximum concentration, but only at a certain distance. He had to do all this calculation. If anybody had been able to do it, it was him. And the parabolic mirror supposedly incinerated the Roman fleet time and again, preventing them from landing. This was regarded as a fairy tale. It was unbelievable for literally hundreds and hundreds of years, again until recent times. In the 1970s, a Greek naval officer wanted to see if it could be reproduced. And so he tried to reproduce it successfully, using the information that exists. And a lot of information still does exist about this. The basic calculations that Archimedes did and so forth, the distances between the defenses of Syracuse and the attacking Roman ships, all this, a lot of this still exists. And he was able to do that with the help of the Greek Navy, the modern Greek Navy, this Greek naval officer, and found that it did succeed, that it was able to set a boat on fire. Then another experiment was done as recently as about 10 years ago. There was a television program called the Mythbusters, and they tried to reproduce the experiment that Archimedes had, and they found it succeeded even more easily than the earlier Greek naval experiment. So this unquestionably did happen. There's a lot of other internal evidence to suggest that he, in fact, was able to manipulate the sun's rays. If so, then how come this weapon wasn't used thereafter? Well, in my research, I found that it was used for hundreds of years thereafter, but it was a very difficult weapon to use. You had to really have almost a computer genius with you to operate this device. It also depended upon the clarity of the sky. If you didn't have clear weather conditions, it would not work. You needed a clear blue sky. You needed to know exactly where your enemy was going to be at a specific time, and the placement of your mirror. The mirror, by the way, that was used was highly polished bronze. It was not the mirrors, silver-backed mirrors that we know today. It's highly polished bronze. And in these reproduction experiments that were held by the Greek Navy and later on by the Mythbusters, they also used only highly polished bronze of a parabolic configuration. And they worked really, really well. So it was only their complexity
that really kept this weapon from being used too often, although it was used several times after Archimedes' time. It's highly advanced use of solar energy, and it worked quite well. Okay, and the next one, please. The concept of the parabolic mirror was not exclusive to the Greeks or Archimedes. This is a human skull made by an artifact that was made by the Aztecs. It represents a human skull. It is a human skull. It is plated with jade and other semi-precious stones. It represents the Aztec god Tezcatlipoca. Tezcatlipoca was the war god, and the emphasis here is on its eyes. These eyes are highly polished obsidian, and they represent mirrors. Matter of fact, Tezcatlipoca's name means in English smoking mirror, smoking mirror. And that's because the Aztecs, and going all the way back to the Olmecs, more than 1,000 years before the Aztecs, they had parabolic mirrors, highly polished obsidian mirrors. And these mirrors were used to set fires for cooking, and they were also used as weapons. The next one. This is a highly polished mirror, one of dozens that have been found. This one goes back to Olmec times. Their polishing techniques are really very modern. This looks like a modern mirror, and in fact, it's over 3,000 years old. It also is parabolic, which means it can focus the rays of the sun. The hole at the top represents where it would be hung, probably in a place where food preparation was engaged, it was being done, because these parabolic mirrors were used often for cooking, but they were also used as weapons. Next. So that sun technology is really quite an amazing thing. To use solar energy as an applied solar energy is something that's really very modern. This is a very peculiar place, and it's called Tula. It is a pre-Aztec city in eastern Mexico. It's made by a great people called the Toltecs, who preceded the Aztecs. The Toltec were still around when the Aztecs got going, but by that time the Toltec culture was in decline. What's interesting about Tula is not only these fellows here, but because Tula is the only place so far known in all of Mesoamerica or ancient Mexico, matter of fact, all of the ancient Americas, in which there was a lot of vitrification going on. Vitrification is the application of high temperatures, very high hot temperatures to stone. And when you apply those high temperatures to stone, you create glass to make a glassy effect. And Tula was a place that was a center for vitrification, especially something known as the plumbate ware. Plumbate ware is this beautiful pottery that the people of Tula made, exceptionally beautiful. It has a glassy sheen to it. And this plumbate pottery, which is very costly, valued, could have only been made under the application of exceedingly high temperatures. Temperatures so high, they're beyond anything that we imagine that the ancient Aztecs or the Toltecs were capable of making. Very high. How could you make not only how could you make these high temperatures, how could you concentrate them in such a small area? There are other examples of vitrification of whole walls at Tula. No place else in the Americas. Also, no place else in America are these figures. What are they holding in their right hands? What are those things? They look like little pistols of some kind. Nobody knows what those things are. It was thought at one time they were incense dispensers, or why these guys are standing around with incense dispensers. Nobody could imagine. Nobody knows what they are. Next slide. This is a drawing. Unfortunately, a photograph of this is almost impossible to take because it is in an extremely cramped and shaded area of Tula, within a few paces of those colossal statues I just showed you. And it shows this drawing, by the way, is extremely accurate. This is just what it looks like. It's carved in kind of bas relief. It's faded. The only way you can really see exactly what it looks like is if you had like a paper over it and you outlined it. But this is as close as you can get, and it's close. And it shows one of these figures holding one of those weird pistol-like things. And it looks like, I mean, this is an interpretation, but I don't know what else to think. It looks like flames are coming out of this device that he's holding, and he's shooting it off against a wall. Does this represent some kind of flamethrower-like or acetylene torch technology that they had? Next slide. This is an example of this plumbate ware, and you can see the terrific sheen on this thing. And it has been entirely vitrified with temperatures that no one thought the Toltecs or anybody in ancient Mexico were capable of doing. It would seem that the Toltecs had some kind of technology that was able to focus extremely high temperatures on small objects like this plumbate ware, and on larger objects like the wall that was being shown and suggested, at least, in that cartoon that I showed you. Because there is an entire wall at Tula that is vitrified. Was this done with a solar cannon, similar to Archimedes, or did they have some other way of doing it? What we do know is that the Toltecs did have something that could concentrate extremely high temperatures to create this beautiful ware. Next. This is, again, one of the most outstanding examples of human achievement you'll find anywhere. This is in India, a very famous place called Delhi. This is known as the Iron Pillar of Delhi. No one knows how old it is. It is at least 700 or 600 years old, at least. But I don't think any archaeologists believe that it's even that new. It goes back a good 1,000 years or more. There's no way to really date it. They've been able to try to date it because of its association. There's an inscription on it, which relates to this one dynasty, but that inscription could have been made long after this thing was made. Okay, the Iron Pillar of Delhi, it's solid iron, and it stands in open view in the public. It's been the subject of rainstorms for at least 700 or 600 years, has no rust on it. Actually, I have to qualify that. It does have a thin veneer of rust you can see towards the bottom especially. But any other object, certainly an object of that size, exposed to the elements for centuries, would have long ago completely deteriorated. This has not. They believe, I mean by they, metallurgists think they understand at long last why it does not rust. It is an extremely complex structure. It's not just iron. It's made of a compound of numerous different elements. Some are metallurgical and others are not. It's a chemical enigma. And the archaeologists and the metallurgists are beginning to understand that there is an element to it that could possibly explain why this has not rusted. This is slow, ongoing work. The last I read about the Delhi Pillar goes back to about 3 years ago. And the researchers think they're on the verge of understanding what this is. And that's a tremendous breakthrough, because if we can find out exactly why this thing does not rust except for this thin veneer, then we can reproduce it for ourselves. And it's another example. This is an example of a technology which is beyond anything that we have achieved up to this point. At this point, we cannot duplicate this pillar. That rust, by the way, on the outside is part of the process. They know now that it was allowed to rust the entire thing had a coating of rust on it. The top proportions have been just eroded away by time. It was allowed it to rust. And then after the little rust started, that was part of the process of preservation, of conservation. It's very complex. Whoever imagined this thing and applied it was privy to a science which is beyond our duplication at this point, but it might be soon. This is another example, and there are many examples that I cite in the book, in which ancient technology is contributing to our technology today. Things that we did not understand, now beginning to understand and becoming part of our own culture. Next. This is another shot of that, and you can see that it's standing in the open air, and it has suffered some very slight damage over time. Well, it's to be understood, but it's still standing. Next. This is a remarkable enigma no one understands. This structure on the right is supposed to be one of the towers that are used in Islam to call the faithful to prayer, and that's what it's used as today. That's not what it was originally made as. No one knows why it was made or who it was made by. The interesting thing about this tower is that it is exactly twice as large as the Delhi Iron Pillar. What possible relationship could these two structures have? Were they part of some kind of an electrical system, an electrical device, a complex of some kind? Who knows? Next. Oh, I'm sorry, there was a question. I just happened to see it. Somebody asked, and oh, I guess we lost it. Somebody asked a question. Well, I'll try to address, I won't go on much longer. I'll try to wind this up and take some questions. Let's see, it's how long should I go on, Paul, before I take questions? Hello, Paul? Can you understand me?
Yes, I can. It's
okay.
too awkward to control this here.
I'm sorry.
Yeah. Well, it's 10 minutes to 9, so you could go on another, well, officially till 9 o'clock. But
all right, I'll go on for about 5 minutes then, just another 5 minutes.
Okay.
All right, well, let's move ahead to the next one then, because this would take too much time to discuss.
Yeah, okay. So fire this up again.
Go on to the next one. This is very famous structure. It's one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. This is the Pharaoh's lighthouse. And it's a very accurate reconstruction. There's really not too much mystery in what it looked like. This was a very beautiful, tremendous building. And it had a light in it that was remarkable because it could be seen 120 miles at sea. Now, if you have a light that can be seen 120 miles at sea, it must be incredibly bright. And people that took a serious interest in this said, well, how could you burn something of that? I mean, this is obviously, the Pharaoh's lighthouse was built centuries, millennia before the advent of applied electricity. So obviously they had to burn something at the top. It was discovered, among other things, that in order to make a light bright enough to be seen 120 miles at sea, it would require enough fuel to keep burning that would have totally burned up every living thing, every plant, every tree in Lebanon, which of course didn't happen. So there is a very brilliant electronic engineer by name of Larry Radke, whose book I really rely on. Brilliant and also a very commonsensical approach to this. And he shows how the Pharaoh's lighthouse was an arc light, which means that somebody had to understand the basic principles of electricity, that only an arc light could have functioned at the top of the Pharaoh's lighthouse. And he deconstructs with extreme conviction how a burning torchlight beacon at the top was totally impossible. No margin for considering such a thing. That could only have been an arc light. And Well, we can go on with this. Again, it takes way too much time than we have here. Next one. And this is basically how it worked. This is called a thermopile. And you can see to the left there, the little arc appearing. These were batteries in series, and they were capable of the ancients of having made. They're not difficult to make. You could just literally fill them with orange juice and they would work. Zinc and tin, and it's not as complex as it looks. The battery is in series, and this is the basic form of what Larry Radke was able to describe, I think, with great credibility, that powered the Pharaoh's Lighthouse. So the ancients were masters of building this bright light that could be seen 120 miles at sea. Next. This is what it looked like. This is a modern day arc light. An arc light is really a very simple device in which you create this very bright light between these two carbon rods. And when they're at the proper distance to each other and charged with this inline battery that I showed, series of batteries, they will produce this very bright light. And it was these carbon arcs that were at the top of the Pharaoh's Lighthouse, according to Radke, whose book really needs to be restudied. It should be a textbook. Next. This is all that remains of the Pharaoh's Lighthouse today. This is at the bottom of the Mediterranean, and this is part of the structure, which was destroyed in an earthquake, toppled the entire place. It only lasted for maybe 70, 80 years. That's all, when the earthquake utterly destroyed it. Next. Well, we don't have much time left, so move ahead. One more. This is something that I guess it's good to end on this, more on electricity. This is a rather famous thing now. This is a wall carving on the side of an Egyptian temple called Dendera. And people think it looks like the representation of a bulb, an electrical bulb of some kind. And it is, and it isn't. In my research, I was able to find out that, go ahead, next slide. Because of this man. His name was Rudolf Garn. He passed away a few years ago. He was one of the leading electrical engineers of Europe. He worked for Siemens Electrical, for gosh sake. He was their chief consultant there. And a newspaper journalist, reporter, asked him, what did he think of the possibilities for the ancient Egyptians having electricity to light a bulb with, suggested by those temple drawings. And he thought it was ridiculous. Is impossible, until he looked into it. And to make a very long story short, cut to the chase, he was able to identify all of the separate pieces portrayed at on the wall carvings of Dendera as part of a Crookes tube. Well, what's a Crookes tube? Next. This is a Crookes tube, and see the resemblance between this and the Egyptian wall carvings. A Crookes tube was invented in the mid to late 1800s by William Crookes, who was the inventor of the fluorescent bulb. And that's what this is. So what the Egyptians had, what they invented or inherited, who knows what, they had a Crookes tube. But why are they showing a Crookes tube on the inside of this religious temple? Well, it's real easy to find out, but I don't think anybody else has done this before. I was able to read the texts that explain on the wall what this thing is about. And they describe it as a light emitting device. Oh, how much more clear can it be? And this device was used at a specific ceremony. It was used the way we put on laser shows today. This Crookes device was used by the priests of ancient Egypt to wow the crowds, to get them all excited about their religious festivals. This thing was only turned on, it was only used during a particular religious ceremony. You know, you're calling God's light into the night. And, but it shows that the Egyptians did have mastery of at least fundamental electronic devices. There's a lot more to it than I've just told you, believe me. One suggestion of this is, how is it possible for the ancient Egyptians to go underground and to create their marvelous mortuary temples, everything covered with incredible hieroglyphs and temple art? What was the source of their light? The ceilings of all these temples never display the ash marks or the burn marks of torches. Torches wouldn't work anyway in an underground environment because it would sap all of the oxygen and they all die of suffocation. And yet there's no indication of any light source at all. How did they do it? This is how they did it. They had electricity. They could light their way. But this type of electricity was different than our electrical use of electricity was totally different than ours. Ours is public. Everybody has access to it. Not so in ancient Egypt. It was sacred. It was only in the trust and the control of the priests, the high priests that ran the country, because the light was mysterious. You could manipulate people by showing them what the spectacular display was, that sort of a thing. Well, I'm going to stop it now because this is a very long subject. I'm just going to wind it up by saying all this technology did the ancient people no good. It was fine while it lasted, but their big mistake was relying upon it to do whatever they wanted to do. And they suffered for that by losing their high culture. And that, I think, is the great lesson for us. Just like Edgar Cayce said, he said that technology is a great servant and a very cruel God. And I think that we need to make that same balance that Edgar Cayce saw being the trouble for other previous civilizations. So I'll stop it here. If anybody has any questions, I'll do my best to try to answer.
I'll read a question here from Hope, which I think might have been the one you saw come in. Delhi Pillar. Could it be an artifact of India being an outpost of Atlantis?
I'm sorry, I didn't care. What is it?
The Delhi Pillar?
Oh, the Delhi Pillar?
Could it be an artifact of India being an outpost of Atlantis?
I didn't quite honestly see a connection between the pillar and Atlantis.
Okay.
But I would not rule it out. There are numerous traditions amongst the Indian Rajas about an Atlantean type of precursor civilization. Mm-hmm. But there is no doubt that the pillar could have only been made by a society that was far in advance of anything that came afterwards, and is even in advance of what we know today. It's in advance of what we know today because we cannot make anything of what appears to be solid iron that can stand through centuries of rain and water and not erode. So it's making the discovery of its secrets is making an impact on our own time. I could talk about, I won't mention it because it's too long, but the medical achievements that the ancient Egyptians achieved are fundamentally changing the advancement of treatment in our society too. So I wouldn't say that the Iron Pillar is Atlantean, because I just don't know at this point, but I would say that it represents a very high culture that is long gone. Could have been them.
I've got a question. Do you have any thoughts about the helicopter hieroglyphs at, I believe, Abydos?
Yes.
Temple of Seti?
Right. Of course, the archaeologists will laugh at it about the helicopter. The trouble is that representation of the helicopter is not found anyplace else, so far as I know.
Yeah.
It is not a hieroglyph. We have to understand, and the archaeologists will tell us this, that the Egyptians made representations of things they saw, of things they knew, things they were familiar with. They didn't just engage in fantasy.
Yeah.
So what does that mean? That somebody in ancient Egypt saw a helicopter-like device? It's entirely possible, because look at someone like Leonardo da Vinci, who is actually the theoretical inventor of the helicopter. He invented the helicopter design at a time that was no more removed from the development of a helicopter than the ancient Egyptians were. Mm-hmm. Renaissance Italy didn't have any claim on any kind of aeronautical designs any more than ancient Egypt did. And yet a great genius like Leonardo da Vinci was able to envision such a thing. We know too that a great genius like Archimedes was able to harness solar energy. So it is not impossible that some unknown forgotten genius also at least built a prototype of the helicopter. Otherwise, it would not have been featured on that wall. So I believe that it is a helicopter device. And it was something that someone saw and put on that wall. I would like to see the rest of the text on that Abydos site with the helicopter, supposed helicopter, to see if there's any reference to such a thing, because there is such a reference to light at Dendera that shows these light bulbs, these Crookes tubes. And the text says itself that these things are emanations of light. So there we are.
Yeah. Anybody else? Any other questions?
Please come back. Okay. Well, it's a fascinating thing, and I'm very happy to be able to discuss some of it with you. And it just really it helps put us, I think, in perspective to see these things, that we're maybe not the greatest thing that's ever come down the pike, that we have a lot to learn from the ancients. And the biggest lesson, though, I think, is the fragility of a civilization. People think our civilization will go on forever because we have jet bombers and refrigerators and fancy cars and so on. But no, when a society falls, all that is lost. And then future societies try to pick up the pieces and start all over again. I don't think that we are exempt from that same fragility. And,
you know the story of the Apollo rocket and the engines? They didn't keep the records, so they didn't know how they built them. They had to go back and get them from scrapyards and try to relearn it, which is amazing. That was just a relatively few years in the same civilization.
I know.
We're talking about.
There's a kind of amnesia, a cultural amnesia going on.
Yeah.
And it's to our detriment that we don't appreciate that,
Yeah.
But the technology we walk a fine line with that. It's great to have all this stuff, and technology gives us all these luxuries and things, and that's great. That's fine. But we never can be allowed to lose our humanity in all that.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, the great lesson that comes from these past civilizations, because we're not exempt from this. We're not that special. The civilizations that preceded us are in the dozens, and they lasted many years longer than ours has so far. So we have to be careful.
Yep. So is your book out right now?
Yes, the Ancient High Tech has come out, and it's available at Amazon.com. There's an audiobook version of it. I didn't recite it, somebody else did, but that's pretty good. Yeah, there it is. And this book's been out for about a month now, month and a half, something like that.
Cool.
There's a lot more to it than I was able to touch on tonight, that's for sure.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of great stuff.
All right.
Okay, well, again, thanks for everybody coming out tonight, and hope I didn't ruin your evening. You could have watched something on the tube or something, and would have been more entertaining perhaps, but
Oh no, this is great.
I just get too excited about this stuff, that's all. So thanks for your indulgence in that.
Okay, thank you, Frank.
Okay.
Thank you, Frank. Nothing better.
Oh, I wouldn't go that far.
Oh, yeah, no, I would.
Oh, well, that's very
There's
sweet.
on
Of
TV
you.
like you.
Very sweet of you. Very, very sweet of all of you. So, okay. Well,
All right.
okay, good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.
Hey,
Thank you,
everybody.
Frank.
Bye-bye.
Well, in a couple weeks.
Okay, that's right. We got something coming up.
Thank you, Frank.
That's right.
Thank
we got
you. Good night.
biodynamic and organic gardening.
Yeah. We have to do some bioengineering of our own, I guess. Huh?
Yeah.
All right. Thanks to everybody.
Thank
We'll
you.
see you later. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Yeah,
Bye.
bye.
And we're hoping to get Frank back in February, I believe, if he's able, to speak on the Emerald Tablets of Thoth.
Yes. Excellent. All right. Down to 4.
And then there were 4.
3.
3, 2, 1.
I'm buying Wally's Prouts. He's gone. See ya. Bye.